Bhopal, the capital of Madhya Pradesh, India. Known as the City of Lakes, it was home to over 900,000 people in 1984. A place of ancient mosques, bustling markets, and quiet neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. But on the night of December 2, 1984, Bhopal would become the site of the world's worst industrial disaster. In 1969, Union Carbide India Limited established a pesticide plant on the outskirts of Bhopal. The facility was designed to manufacture 7, a pesticide used by farmers across India to protect their crops. The key ingredient? Methyl isocyanate, or MIC, a highly toxic and volatile chemical compound. At the time, the plant was seen as a symbol of progress, bringing jobs and modern technology to central India. But over the years, safety standards would deteriorate, maintenance would be deferred, and cost-cutting measures would compromise worker safety. By 1984, the Bhopal plant was struggling. Pesticide sales had declined, and the facility was operating at a loss. Union Carbide implemented severe cost-cutting measures. The workforce was reduced from 12 operators per shift to 6. The refrigeration unit that kept the mic cool, a critical safety feature, had been shut down to save money. The gas scrubber, designed to neutralize escaping gases, was under repair. And the flare tower, meant to burn off leaked gas, was offline. Workers had raised concerns. There had been previous leaks, small ones that caused eye irritation and breathing problems. In 1982, a worker named Ashraf Khan died after being exposed to phosgene gas at the plant. But these warnings went largely unheeded. On the night of December 2nd, approximately 42 tons of mic were stored in Tank 610, far exceeding the recommended maximum. December 2nd, 1984. The night shift began as usual at the Union Carbide plant. Workers went about their duties, unaware that a catastrophic sequence of events was already in motion. At around 10:30 p.m., water began entering Tank 610 through a connected pipe during a routine washing procedure. This water should never have reached the mic. But multiple safety systems had failed. Valves that should have been closed were open. Pipes that should have been isolated weren't. When water mixed with the methyl isocyanate, a violent exothermic reaction began. The temperature inside the tank started rising rapidly, from the normal 32 degrees Fahrenheit to over 200 degrees. Pressure built inside the sealed tank. By 12:40 a.m. on December 3rd, the pressure in Tank 610 had exceeded its maximum limit. Workers heard a loud hissing sound. The concrete over the tank was cracking. And then the safety valve gave way. 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas, mixed with other toxic substances produced by the chemical reaction, began venting into the cold night air. The gas was heavier than air, so it didn't disperse upward. Instead, it rolled across the ground like a deadly fog, drifting toward the densely populated neighborhoods that surrounded the plant. The wind that night was calm, moving at just 2 miles per hour, which meant the gas cloud moved slowly, lingering in each area it touched. The neighborhoods closest to the plant, Jaiprakash Nagar, Kazi Camp, Chola, were home to some of Bhopal's poorest residents. These were informal settlements where people lived in simple homes, many without proper ventilation or warning systems. As the gas cloud approached, people were sleeping. They had no idea what was coming. There was no alarm, no evacuation order, no warning of any kind. The first symptoms came quickly. People woke up with burning eyes, struggling to breathe. The gas irritated mucous membranes, causing violent coughing and vomiting. Victims described feeling like their eyes were being stabbed with needles, like their lungs were on fire. As the gas swept through the neighborhoods, panic erupted. People burst from their homes, gasping for air, trying to escape the invisible killer. Parents grabbed their children. Families ran through the streets, but there was nowhere to go. The gas was everywhere. Those who ran actually fared worse than those who stayed indoors, as running caused them to breathe more deeply, inhaling more of the toxic gas into their lungs. People stumbled, blinded by tears, suffocating. Bodies began falling in the streets. The fortunate ones collapsed quickly and died. Others endured hours of agony, coughing up froth tinged with blood, their lungs filling with fluid, essentially drowning in their own bodily fluids. Within hours, Bhopal's hospitals were overwhelmed. Hamidia Hospital, the city's main medical facility, was flooded with thousands of victims. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, but they didn't know what chemical they were treating. Union Carbide officials initially refused to disclose the full composition of the gas, claiming trade secrets. Without this crucial information, medical staff couldn't provide proper treatment. The corridors filled with the dying and the dead. There weren't enough oxygen cylinders, not enough beds, not enough doctors. Medical staff worked with cloths tied over their faces, their own eyes burning from the gas that clung to patients' clothing. They did what they could, administered oxygen, gave eye drops, treated symptoms, but for many, it was already too late. As dawn broke on December 3rd, the full scale of the disaster became apparent. The streets of Bhopal were littered with bodies. Men, women, children, even animals. Dogs, cows, birds. Nothing that breathed was spared. Volunteers and emergency workers moved through the neighborhoods with trucks, collecting the dead. Many of the bodies showed no external injuries. They looked as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. By some estimates, between 3,000 and 8,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of the gas leak. But the true death toll would be much higher. In the weeks and months that followed, thousands more would die from exposure-related illnesses. For those who survived, the nightmare was far from over. The gas exposure caused devastating long-term health effects. Respiratory problems, particularly chronic bronchitis and asthma, plagued survivors. Many suffered permanent eye damage, including corneal erosions and early-onset cataracts. Neurological problems emerged, memory loss, numbness in limbs, psychiatric disorders. Women who were pregnant at the time of the disaster faced increased rates of miscarriage and stillbirth. Children born in the aftermath showed higher rates of birth defects and developmental problems. A study conducted years later found that children born in gas-affected areas had significantly reduced lung function and higher rates of respiratory illness. The Union Carbide plant site itself became a toxic wasteland. After the disaster, the plant was abandoned but never properly cleaned. Hazardous chemicals remained in tanks, drums, and pipes. These toxins gradually seeped into the soil and groundwater. Studies conducted in the years following the disaster found elevated levels of heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, and other toxic substances in the groundwater around the plant site. Communities living near the abandoned factory, some of the same communities devastated by the gas leak, now faced a second, slower-moving disaster. Water from contaminated wells caused new health problems. Children born decades after the disaster showed signs of chemical exposure. The poison that was released in a single night continued to spread, slowly and silently, through the earth and water. In the aftermath of the disaster, survivors and advocates sought justice. Union Carbide's chairman, Warren Anderson, was charged with manslaughter by Indian authorities. He was briefly detained in India on December 7, 1984, but was released on bail and left the country. He never returned to face trial. The Indian government issued an arrest warrant, and Anderson remained a fugitive from Indian justice until his death in 2014. In 1989, Union Carbide settled with the Indian government for $470 million, an amount widely criticized as grossly inadequate. Divided among the survivors, this amounted to an average of just $550 per victim. For comparison, Union Carbide's market value at the time was over $10 billion. In 2001, Dow Chemical acquired Union Carbide but refused to assume liability for the Bhopal disaster, claiming it had inherited no such obligation. The survivors of Bhopal refused to be forgotten. Organizations like the Bhopal Gas Peedit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, the Bhopal Gas Affected Women Workers Organization, fought for proper compensation, medical care, and cleanup of the contaminated site. Activists staged protests, marches, and hunger strikes. They traveled to the United States to demand accountability from Union Carbide and Dow Chemical. One of the most prominent voices was Rashida B., a gas survivor who became an international advocate for the victims. Along with Kampa Devi Shukla, she was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2004 for her work. These women, many of whom were illiterate and had never left India before, took their fight to international forums, speaking at the United Nations and confronting corporate executives. Even 4 decades after the disaster, survivors continue to struggle with health problems. The Bhopal Memorial Hospital and Research Center was established to provide specialized care for gas victims, but the demand far exceeds its capacity. Chronic respiratory disease remains the most common complaint. Many survivors require lifelong medication just to breathe comfortably. The psychological trauma has also been profound. Survivors witnessed unimaginable horrors: families dying together, children separated from parents in the chaos, the helplessness of watching loved ones suffer without being able to help them. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety are common among survivors. Yet mental health services remain limited. Today, a second generation lives with the consequences of that night in 1984. Children and grandchildren of survivors face higher rates of illness despite never having been directly exposed to the gas. Some researchers believe this is due to continuing groundwater contamination. Others point to genetic damage caused by the original exposure, passed down through generations. The true cause is likely a combination of both. These young people have grown up in the shadow of a disaster they didn't experience. They've watched their parents and grandparents struggle with health problems and fight for recognition. Many have joined the activism efforts, demanding that the contaminated site finally be cleaned and that proper compensation be provided to all those affected. The Bhopal disaster raised fundamental questions about corporate responsibility in a globalized world. When a multinational corporation operates in a developing country, who is responsible when something goes wrong? Union Carbide argued that the Bhopal plant was operated by its Indian subsidiary, Union Carbide India Limited, and therefore it bore limited responsibility. Critics countered that Union Carbide maintained control over safety standards and procedures. The case exposed regulatory weaknesses in India and the challenges of enforcing safety standards in facilities operated by foreign companies. It highlighted the disparity in how human life is valued in different parts of the world. Compensation that might be considered adequate in India would be completely insufficient in the United States or Europe. In the wake of Bhopal, industrial safety standards began to change worldwide. In the United States, Congress passed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in 1986, requiring facilities to report on hazardous chemicals and to develop emergency response plans. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration strengthened regulations on hazardous chemical storage and handling. The disaster became a case study in business schools and engineering programs worldwide, teaching students about the catastrophic consequences of prioritizing profit over safety. The phrase Bhopal itself became shorthand for industrial negligence. Yet despite these reforms, similar disasters have occurred in the decades since: in Seveso, Italy; in Flixborough, England; in more recent accidents in China and Bangladesh. The lessons of Bhopal, it seems, must be constantly relearned. Today, the former Union Carbide plant site remains largely as it was abandoned in 1984. Rusted equipment stands frozen in time. Buildings are collapsing. Nature has begun to reclaim the facility, with trees growing through roofs and vines covering tanks. But beneath this post-apocalyptic scene, the poison remains. The Indian government has repeatedly announced plans to clean up the site, but as of 2024, comprehensive remediation has not occurred. The site has become an unlikely tourist destination, with visitors coming to see what one writer called an industrial catastrophe preserved in amber. Local guides, many of them survivors or children of survivors, lead tours through the facility, telling the story of what happened and continuing their fight for justice. Every December 2nd, survivors and supporters gather in Bhopal to remember those who died and to renew their call for justice. Candlelight vigils are held at the plant site and at a memorial in the city. Names of the dead are read aloud, a process that takes hours. Survivors share their stories with younger generations, ensuring that the disaster is not forgotten. The Bhopal Memorial itself is a haunting tribute, a sculpture of a woman and child, faces contorted in agony, surrounded by walls bearing the names of victims. Nearby, the Remember Bhopal Museum documents the disaster through photographs, artifacts, and personal testimonies. These spaces serve not just as memorials but as calls to action, reminding visitors that the fight for justice continues. Listen to the voices of those who were there. Kampa Devi Shukla, who lost 5 gas-exposed pregnancies and whose grandchildren still suffer health effects, says, "We survivors are like living corpses. Every moment is a painful reminder of that night." Rashida B., who has spent decades fighting for justice, says, "We will not give up. We will fight until our last breath for the compensation we deserve, for the medical care we need, and for the cleanup that has been promised but never delivered." Sudhinath Sarangi, a doctor who has worked with Bhopal survivors for over 30 years, observes, "The tragedy of Bhopal is not just what happened in 1984. It's what continues to happen. The ongoing exposure to contaminated water, the children born with birth defects, the survivors denied adequate medical care, the perpetrators who faced no real consequences." The Bhopal disaster resonated far beyond India. It became a symbol of the dangers of industrialization without adequate safety measures, of the power imbalance between corporations and communities, of the global disparities in how human life is valued. Environmental justice movements around the world cite Bhopal as a cautionary tale. The disaster influenced international law, contributing to the development of principles regarding transnational corporate liability and the rights of communities affected by industrial operations. Yet the legal and ethical questions raised by Bhopal remain largely unresolved. How do we balance economic development with safety? Who bears responsibility when things go wrong? How do we ensure that the most vulnerable communities aren't left to bear the brunt of industrial hazards? Scientists have studied the Bhopal disaster extensively, examining both the immediate effects and the long-term health and environmental consequences. Studies have documented elevated cancer rates, chromosomal abnormalities, and immunological changes in survivors. Research on soil and water contamination has revealed the persistent presence of toxic substances decades after the disaster. These studies have been crucial in understanding the full impact of mic exposure and in developing treatment protocols for survivors. However, research has been hampered by lack of funding, limited access to medical records from the immediate aftermath, and the complex interaction of factors affecting survivors' health. Many questions remain unanswered, and survivors continue to participate in studies, hoping that the knowledge gained might help prevent future disasters or at least improve care for themselves and their children. For decades later, justice for Bhopal remains elusive. The cleanup has not been completed. Full compensation has not been provided. No corporate executive has been held truly accountable. In 2010, 7 former employees of Union Carbide India Limited were convicted of death by negligence and sentenced to 2 years in prison, a sentence many considered a slap on the wrist for a disaster that killed thousands. By that time, most were elderly men, and they remained free on bail. Survivors continue to demand that Dow Chemical assume responsibility for the cleanup and provide additional compensation. Dow continues to refuse, maintaining that it acquired Union Carbide's assets, not its liabilities. The legal battle continues in courts in India and the United States, with no resolution in sight. Meanwhile, the contaminated groundwater continues to affect new generations. What can we learn from Bhopal? First, that corner cutting on safety has consequences that are measured in human lives. Second, that effective regulation and enforcement are essential, particularly when dealing with hazardous materials. Third, that communities living near industrial facilities have a right to know what chemicals are present and what emergency plans exist. Fourth, that corporate accountability cannot end at national borders. Perhaps most importantly, Bhopal teaches us that the true cost of industrial disasters extends far beyond the immediate aftermath. The suffering continues for generations. The environmental damage persists for decades. The fight for justice can last a lifetime. As we face new industrial challenges, from chemical manufacturing to nuclear power to genetic engineering, the lessons of Bhopal have never been more relevant. In Bhopal today, life goes on. The city has grown, new buildings have risen, and a new generation is coming of age. But the scars remain. You can still see them in the faces of survivors who gather at the memorial, in the children born with health problems decades after the gas leaked, in the contaminated groundwater that continues to sicken people. The survivors of Bhopal have shown remarkable resilience. They have rebuilt their lives, raised families, and fought tirelessly for justice. They have turned their tragedy into activism, ensuring that the world does not forget what happened on that December night in 1984. Their struggle continues for proper compensation, for medical care, for cleanup of the contaminated site, and perhaps most fundamentally, for recognition that their lives matter, that their suffering matters, that their fight for justice matters. The story of Bhopal is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's a reminder that every community deserves to be safe, that every life has value, and that justice delayed is justice denied. Until the site is cleaned, until survivors receive proper care and compensation, until those responsible are held accountable, the Bhopal disaster is not history. It is an ongoing injustice demanding our attention and action.